Hi, we continue in Genesis 30 today as we complete the scene of Rachel and Leah having children. And after this scene, we'll see that Jacob goes to Laban and says, "It's time to let us go free." So before we enter into this passage, just a couple of things to set the context. As we've been looking at throughout this unit, on the right side of the screen you can see the three sections of the larger Jacob cycle, and we've been in this middle section here with Jacob and Laban. But at the middle of this section, as we've been looking at, are the women alone. And although Jacob has a role here, a small role alive, he's mostly talked about in the third person and not by name, highlighting that the women are the central characters here. And as we've been looking at this, we've been reading at least these three levels throughout. The immediate plot here of Jacob being used by these women to have children, but the larger story that is within the book of Genesis that we heard back with the oracle to Rebekah in chapter 22 about two nations in your womb, and these children will become the eponymous ancestors of what will later be called the tribes of Israel, later in Genesis, that is. But there's also the post-exilic experience, and that really comes out today, at least implicitly, in the relationship between these women, Rachel and Leah, and the secondary wives, Zilpah and Bilhah, have no character role here. They're not allowed to talk, and we don't know what their experience is of any of this. But these women, as we've been looking at, and I didn't notice in the previous video because I can't quite do everything, but in Leah's immediate childbearing section at the beginning, she thanked Yahweh for this and hoped that Yahweh would help her. And we'll see in our section today, Elohim is mentioned out of the narrator's mouth here in verse 17, but out of Leah's mouth in verse 18. But as I noted at the beginning of this section, the city of Haran, which is not mentioned here after they were sent out by Jacob was sent out by the parents to go there at the beginning of chapter 28. Rather, we just read the east country. These people are Mesopotamians. And as I was noting at the beginning, the chief god of this region is the god Sin, who is both an expression of the moon, but also the expression of fertility, and especially for pregnant women. And yet Sin is never mentioned here, nor is the older and more powerful chief deity Marduk, who's important in Babylon. But rather, it's assumed that these people would worship, or at least even know about, Yahweh and Elohim. And of course, the text is in Hebrew, and these people would not be speaking Hebrew, they'd be speaking Akkadian. But the text almost never grapples with that. In fact, later we'll see that Laban is expressed as speaking Aramaean, which was the official language of the Persian Empire, and perhaps suggests even more the post-exilic context of the writing of this story, having him speak Aramaean rather than Akkadian. But in any event, the idea that they just routinely worship, or at least acknowledge, the gods that the Genesis has described as the creator God and the gods that will be the gods of Israel throughout the Hebrew Bible is an interesting thing. And the audience can easily be led to believe that these are Jewish matriarchs, but of course they're not Jews. Jacob's not a Jew either. None of these people are Jews. The concept Jew is completely anachronistic at this point. But they're also not Israelites, because the term Israelite is from the Hebrew Bnei Yisrael, literally the sons of Israel. And so these children here, the sons and Dinah the daughter, are the first Israelites, but the parents are not Israelites. And that's really important, because one of the elements of this way of reading is how much of the old country can we take with us, whether that's material elements or cultural elements, as we'll see. And that issue was already brought up by Laban in tricking Jacob into getting the younger wife first, because he said, in our place it's not done that way. So that's an element of this level that we'll see here, and especially in the scene that follows this. As we've been looking at the shape of this whole unit from 28:10 to 31:18 is a chiasm, as you can see here. And this center section we've been looking at from 21:31 to 30:24, the center of the larger chiasm, is itself a five-part chiasm. And today we're going to look at these B1 and A parts. Not mentioned by letter there, but you can see the same pattern we see here. And two background things that I won't go into in detail, but they'll become more important as we go. Throughout this section, we've been looking at least a little bit at how this story both echoes and refutes the wife-sister stories we saw in Genesis 12, 20, and 26 around the patriarchs Abraham and Isaac trying to trick a foreign king into believing that his wife was his sister. And here we have the flip side, where we have sister wives. And so we'll see more of this in the exit part of the story after this scene. Also important here is how the entire story can be read as an allegory of the monarchy, and we'll see more of that as we go. Last time we saw how Rachel's demanding sons was parallel to Hannah demanding sons at the very beginning of the monarchy story in 1 Samuel 1. And that'll especially come out next time as we see this question, is there any portion or inheritance left us in our father's house? Almost verbatim parallel to the question of David and Israel at the division of the monarchy in 1 Kings 12. So all those things are important, and I won't go over in detail again these two questions that we've been looking at throughout this unit, this immediate unit, just to mention them here. What makes us the people of Yahweh? And our story here is presenting for the first time the idea that descent from Jacob will be that, although as I noted a couple of videos ago, that won't become an expression until the end of Genesis in chapter 49, a generation, or at least half a generation later. And then how is our society organized? And this is against the kind of hierarchy that puts people like Laban and men in general in charge. And what we're seeing in our immediate scene is women using men for their own purposes. So it's an interesting inversion of patriarchy right there. As we've been looking at the language of keywords, we're now in this section here, in this final part, and we see that this phrase that was used before, bore Jacob sons, recurs here 5th and 6th time. As I noted last time, not all the sons are described as bore Jacob a son. So we'll be looking at that again here. And then finally we'll get to the end of it where God remembers Rachel, and she conceives and bears a son, and that's what gets Jacob to decide it's time to go. One last thing we're going to look at in our scene today, because the question of the mandrakes raises this explicitly, is the language of sexuality in Genesis. And I note that from the beginning to the end of Genesis, it goes from the intimate to the crude. So we saw back outside the garden in chapter 4, 3 times we're told the man knew, using yada, his woman, and she conceived and bore a child, as we see. So that's the most intimate sense, that sense of inner knowing, where it's not just a sexual act, and it's certainly not a crude one, but it's about intimacy. A more neutral one here is boel, to go into, or to come into. I translated it to go, come into in one place, and here go into. Here it's normally translated come into because of the woman is speaking rather than the man speaking, but I translated it consistently so we can see it's used in this passage as well. So we see a series of those here, and that's what Jacob expressed when he wanted Rachel in the first place, and that's what we've been seeing so far around Bilhah. But now it gets more crude in our immediate scene here, and this echoes what Lot's daughters wanted to have happen with their father, make him drunk and lie with him. And then the same thing that Abimelech says there to Isaac, that one of his own people might have lain with your wife. We'll see it explicitly crude here with Shechem when it's a rape scene, and here where it's also an inappropriate intercourse where Reuben goes in with Bilhah, Jacob's secondary woman, who we meet in our story here. Again, she's treated with sexual violence with no consent. And then finally with Joseph, when Mrs. Potiphar demands that he lie with her. And so it's an interesting element of how Genesis shows the farther you get from the garden, the less sexuality is about intimacy. And certainly our immediate scene has nothing whatsoever to do with intimacy. Jacob is not even in relationship. He's simply the provider of sperm for producing children. And as I was noting last time, the scene here, where especially around the mandrakes, where they're seeking to compete over the question of which one of them will have the sexual attraction and or the fertility, is certainly parallel to the blessing story, because I noted when we looked at that in chapter 27 and earlier throughout Genesis, Baruchah, blessing in Genesis, is about fertility and abundance, not about abundance of money and acquisition, but about fertility, that more life. So blessing is life, and fertility in the garden meant life, and we heard the blessing throughout the creation story in Genesis 1. And so what the brothers were really arguing about there was which one of them would have the right to future fertility. And yet, as I was noting, the paternal blessing is not really effective any more than the mandrakes are here. But both of them show the cultural context of Jacob and Esau within their family setting, and now the daughters within their family setting struggling over the access to fertility. And neither of them are effective. Only God provides for fertility, and yet is it Yahweh or Elohim or something else? And that's something that will come up in our scene here. So, as we've been noting also, our story is completely stylized, at least the story between the two women until now, and this is the only time there's actually something we might call a scene. Rather than the narrator just saying that the woman got pregnant and conceived and bore a child and named the child, here we actually have something like a conversation with a place. It's the only reference to a place we've seen since Laban called Jacob into the house after he first met Rachel at the well. So let's, with no further ado, enter into our passage today. In the days of wheat harvest, Kitzur Hatim here, presupposing a later agricultural economy that we know from other contexts, but this would take place in early spring, and there are going to be a couple references to field here. Reuben went out and found mandrakes in the field, and Jacob comes in from the field here, and that recalls what we saw at the beginning of the story where the shepherds were by the well in the field. So that will associate Jacob and Reuben with the situation at the beginning of the story. We don't know how old Reuben is, but he must be a small child, as this very ancient primitive image of it shows. This from the 1100s shows the small child that Reuben is, and found these mandrakes. And if you know mandrakes from Harry Potter, as you can see here, we have to do a little cultural context to express those. And nothing better than the United States Forest Service website that provides a lot of wonderful detail and pictures on this plant. But what's plainly at issue here, and you can see from this example, that the root structure is suggestive of the lower half of a body, and in some cases of a female body. If you were to look on the internet as I did, you can find all kinds of mandrake roots that have been carved to make them even more look like human bodies. But just in their natural state, they have their roots crossed as if they were legs crossed. As you can see in my note down below, the Hebrew word here is dudaim, and it's only in this scene of the Song of Songs. And yet Wenham notes it's very similar in verbal quality to dodim, which is beloved, which is very close to the name for David. If we didn't have the vowels there, you could see Dod is David there, and the V stands for the O sound in there. So one of the many parallels between the David story and what we're seeing here. But it's frequent in the Song of Songs in suggesting love plant as the name from Dudaim, similar to beloved. And yet, was it understood as aphrodisiac qualities, which is to say, to stimulate sexual desire, or fertility qualities, to stimulate the possibility of pregnancy? And we've not had any reason to believe that Rachel needs to get Jacob interested in her, although in the last scene we saw, she demanded that he give her children or she would die, and he got very angry at her and argued back, am I in the place of God? So we don't know what their relationship is like at this point, but the mandrakes would be presumably for an aphrodisiac quality rather than for a fertility quality. So Reuben brought them to his mother Leah, and then Rachel says to Leah, in the only private conversation they have in the entire book here. And it presents them as rivals. And we already saw in the last scene that they were perceiving each other as rivals, but now we see it explicitly. So she starts off politely, please give me some of your son's mandrakes. And she notes that they are the sons. How she knows that, we don't know. She must have just seen it as far as we can tell. And as my note below has, she knows she has no leverage in this situation, therefore must plead. But Leah responds, and notice here, Leah is reduced to a pronoun. Rachel is mentioned here, and in here as an active subject of the speaker here, but Leah is not. So Leah said to her, is it a small matter here, using the word hamat here, and as my note from Wenham has, direct questions introduced by this phrase usually express great exasperation by the speaker, and here's a couple examples of that. So that expresses the emotional content of this here, that Leah's thinking, you've already taken my man, now you're going to take my mandrakes. But notice the language here, the taking away, not only as my note below has, that she characterized her sister as taker, but she's also a taker with no irony. We noted in the last scene that she had no hesitation to take Zilpah and give her to Jacob as an Isha, as a woman. So she's acting like a traditional man there in the monarchical view of things from 1 Samuel 8, that kings take, and yet she doesn't notice the irony that her sister is acting just as she did to take things. So she raises that, is it a small matter? You've taken my man, and notice my man. How is he her man and not our man? It's been 7 years now, as far as we can tell, that Jacob has been having sex with both of them, and yet Leah has to all this time never acknowledged that Rachel has any right to Jacob. So she says, would you also take away my son's mandrakes? And Rachel says, not arguing with it or not answering directly to the rhetorical question, then he may lie with you tonight for your son's mandrakes, which is to say, making a contract offer here. Note below, again in the narrator's description here, underscoring the idea of the intercourse without the intimacy of knowing or going in. It's a crude reference to it. And it's plainly indicating that Jacob has no value of intimacy or relationship here. This is just a matter of using him to establish another pregnancy in the rivalry between the two sisters. So whether Jacob knows anything about this, we don't know, but it's the first time we're hearing him actually being somewhere. He came in from the field, and this is really the first hint we have of what he's been doing in service for Laban all these years. There's been a little implicit mystery because we saw at the very beginning that Rachel was shepherding her father's flocks, and we'll find out soon that the sons, who we've not heard mentioned at all, are out there with the father doing the sheep shearing. So what is there left for Jacob to do? Has Rachel been handling the flocks with him all this time? If we'll see when he makes his, whether you call it a confession or a claim later in front of Laban, he talks simply about him doing it. So we don't know how that shifted over or why Rachel isn't also with the sheep, but we hear him coming in from the field here for the first time. And it's in the evening here, recalling what we saw in 24:11 and 63, when Isaac took Rebekah into his mother's tent in the evening, and then the evening when the Abraham's servant arrived at the well, at the same well that Jacob met Rachel at. So Leah went out to meet him, it's not clear how far that is, and said, you must come in to me. Notice she's making demands, and this is where I translated as go in over here, so that we have the parallel here. So you must go into me, for I have hired you. And it could not be more explicit. And I didn't indicate here the doubling here, but hired, yes, hired, using the form that Hebrew often has to highlight the doubling. And it's only here. Either the noun or the verb are only here in Genesis in this way. Otherwise, it's 20. A similar root is 20 times in Hebrew Scripture, larger than negatively for mercenaries, idol makers, and those kinds of things. In other words, what we might call prostitution. People who are taking their skills and gifts and just using them for hired money rather than for relationship with somebody or for the nation. And so it's really a low blow here that Jacob is just something to be hired. And notice he was hired by Laban, Laban who said what your wages should be, using that similar word here. There's the note from 29:15 notes here. Then now the daughters are hiring him. So he's for hire all around in the old country. And that certainly ought to be telling us something about relationships in the old country here. And so he lay with her that night, and you can substitute whatever crude form of sexual intercourse makes sense to you there. But then we hear a surprise that we hear, but they don't hear, and yet Leah seems to know it, that it's attributed to God. That Elohim heard Leah. Not sure why New RSV uses the awkward heated, but it's simply Shema, heard. And God heard Leah, and she conceived and bore Jacob a fifth son. Notice the fifth son from her here, because we saw others along the way. It's not the fifth total, but the fifth from her body, not counting the ones that we saw here. So Leah says, God has given me my hire here, using the word again, a similar word, not quite the same word as in verse 16, but a key word in the encounter between Jacob and Laban, as we'll see later. As Turner notes, not only does Jacob serve Laban for his wives, but he also serves Leah. This provides another ironic twist on the blessing that announced that the elder would serve the younger. That's in the sense of the boys back in chapter 25. So God is giving me my hire because I gave my maid, or my maid servant, as I've been translating it here, to my man. And so she named him Issachar, as Willa Gavney suggests, payment. A curious name for a child. Let's continue down so we can see the rest of our scene here. And then, with no ceremony or ado, Leah conceived again, and she bore Jacob a sixth son. And we need to ask her, what happened to the mandrakes? Leah and Rachel apparently made the deal that Rachel suggested, that Leah could have him for the night if Rachel could have the mandrakes. But we don't hear about the mandrakes again at all. We simply return to Leah being pregnant again. So at least another year has gone by since this conversation about the mandrakes. So Leah says in naming this one, God has endowed me with a good dowry, Zevedani, only here in the Hebrew Scripture, with a good dowry, Zeved, matching here a word play there. Notice that it's suggesting that God's providing the dowry because Jacob and his family certainly didn't provide one. And that was one of the questions back then, is whether Laban was hiring him in exchange as a dowry present for the wife, or simply because he's not going to turn him into a slave to be a worker, and Jacob has nowhere else to go. But either way, she's suggesting that this is the dowry, which is an interesting thing, her sixth child. And she's now returned to the hope, after all these years, that Jacob will be with her or want to be with her, even though it seemed like she'd given that up around Judah and went off to praising God rather than hoping that it would become a bond between her and her man. The word for honor me, Zabel, is only here in the Hebrew scripture, but other translation possibilities from Jinsan here will dwell with me, from Yar Zakovich will exalt me, and from Bailey will raise me up. So in one way or another, she's seeing herself as low or as isolated and hoping that this child will change that. But notice it's again not about Jacob, it's about God, presuming that she just knows about the gods of the biblical people. And Gaffney translates this as cohabitation. And then just as an afterword, and it's literally an afterword here, she bore a daughter and named her Dinah. And although that is certainly sexist in terms of favoring the sons and just suggesting her as an afterthought and not explaining her name, as Wenham notes, it's extraordinary in itself to mention the birth of the daughters. It is done only if they're going to have an important role to play later, as Rebecca was noted in 22:23, and we can also note as Sarai was noted back in chapter 11, although not her birth, just her presence there. And so we know that Dinah is going to be important later, but in a tragic, violent way. And so Jacob now has all the children he's going to get from Leah, and then suddenly, seemingly out of nowhere, God remembered Rachel. Why now? There's no explanation for that. As Westerman suggests, he argues that the sequence of verbs here is particularly clumsy as part of what he thinks of the reviser's rewriting of the naming aspect of the whole story, but we don't have to go there at all and assume different sources. The stories I've been trying to show you is tightly integrated literarily and theologically, and so there's no reason to imagine different sources. As Turner notes below, God's remembering of Noah had marked the transition between the rising and receding floodwaters in 8:1. Now God's remembering of Rachel marks the transition between Jacob's flight and return. And he heard her, although we hadn't heard that she'd asked for prayer. We hadn't heard that she was praying to Yahweh or that Jacob prayed on her behalf at all. And yet that's what's named here. And opened her womb, framing it as we saw back in 29:31, as we can see here on the right side, framing it up here with the opening her womb. So she conceived and bore a son, as we see here. And Wester made another note about the potential source things that, again, we don't have to go there. God has taken away my reproach. Again, how does she know that? Notice that both times in the last two children, the narrator has told us that God was involved, at least not the middle one, but the fifth here and this one, that God heeded Leah and God remembered and heeded Rachel, and yet it's not out loud, and yet they reached the right conclusion, according to the narrator. God has taken away, or literally gathered, as Crane notes, Asaph, which is one of several word plays on the name Joseph here that we'll see in just a second. So Asaph, like Yosef, but reproach here, at Harpathi here, Kirpa, a word connoting scorn, shame, and disgrace, as Jinsan suggests. And it'll be again in the rape story there, but not about rape, about potentially marrying their daughters off to men who aren't circumcised, is described as a reproach or a disgrace there. And so Rachel is felt disgraced for not having a child, and now she has one, and it's deeply ironic, as we'll see. And as this note below has, in geographic terms, therefore, the omission of Ephraim and Manasseh from the birth narrative is perhaps its most interesting feature. And I won't bring it up now, but as I noted in the first video in this little unit, the listing of all the 12 names of the children, both in this passage and in Genesis 49, and also in the book of Joshua and Deuteronomy and in Numbers, where Ephraim and Manasseh substitute for Joseph. If you're not familiar, as we'll discover, they're the children that Joseph has in Egypt. So they're doubly foreign, if you want that way, being born from an Egyptian priest woman through Joseph. So she names him Joseph here, Yosef, has the different word plays for gather, take away, and add, as we see here with add, Yosef. And as my note below from Zakovich has, she has not even held the child to her breast, and already she is back to her bad habits, competing fiercely with her sister, wanting another one. And she attributes this to Yahweh. Even though she says Elohim here, she asked Yahweh to add to her another son here. And again, if we saw this as two different sources, how could this first verse in 23 about Elohim be complete without the name Joseph, which of course we know throughout the book of Genesis and beyond? So it's with this that finally, when Rachel is born Joseph, Jacob goes to Laban and says, "Send me away." But he's not going to get out of Dodge quite that easily. And for that exciting journey, we'll come and begin that story next time. See you then. Bye-bye.